Okay, so today we're diving into a topic that I think is really interesting, especially when you start thinking about, larger systems and how they're put together.
Yeah.
And that is moving from a big single application, a monolith, towards a more distributed approach like microservices.
Right.
But we're going to focus specifically on that first crucial step.
Okay.
Like, how do you actually start breaking this monolith apart?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, to make it a bit more concrete, let's imagine we're looking at a very specific feature like a customer's wish list.
Okay.
And we want to start making that its own separate service, its own microservice.
Yeah.
I think this is a challenge that comes up a lot
Okay.
and something that, people who are preparing for senior engineering roles
Right.
often think about a lot because
That's a classic system design question, right? How
exactly.
do you take something big and break it down strategically?
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to sort of paint that before picture, right? Like,
Yeah.
imagine everything is just living in one place. The entire application, all the features, including our wish list, is in one code base.
Right.
And all the data, including all the wish list data, is sitting in one single database.
Yep. All bundled together.
Yeah, everything is bundled together. So now when you say, okay, we're going to start making this wish list its own independent entity,
Right.
where do we even begin that separation?
That's the big question.
Right.
And there are actually a couple of main ways we can approach this.
Okay.
So let's start by unpacking one strategy.
Okay.
And this one I'll call the code first approach.
Okay.
So imagine you take just the code responsible for that wish list feature
Okay.
and you put it into a brand new separate, microservice.
Okay.
But here's the catch. You initially leave the actual wish list data in the original monolithic database.
Okay, so I'm picturing like this big monolith, and then we've sort of like taken the wish list code, and it's off in its own little box now.
Yeah, exactly.
But both this new wish list service and the original monolith are still pointing to and using that same database.
Right, they're both connected to that same database for the wish list data.
So it's almost like we've created a new department,
Yeah.
but they still have to go back to the main warehouse for all their stuff.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Now, this code first approach seems to be pretty common.
It is.
Oh.
I think one of the main reasons is that it often provides quicker, more tangible short-term wins.
Oh, okay.
So you've immediately created a separate service for your wish list.
Right.
And that can unlock benefits like being able to scale that wish list feature independently based on its own specific demand.
Okay.
You can deploy changes to just the wish list service more frequently and with less risk.
Right.
And you can have a dedicated team that owns and develops that functionality in isolation.
Okay, so there are advantages from an organizational standpoint and also from like a deployment and scaling perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the downsides? Because it seems like we're leaving this data behind.
Yeah, and that's the key trade-off here. So you're getting these immediate benefits, but you're still tightly coupled to the database of the monolith.
Right.
And that can cause problems down the road.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, for example, that database could become a performance bottleneck
Okay.
if both the monolith and the wishlist service are hitting it really hard.
Right.
Also, any changes to the database schema, even if they're for unrelated parts of the monolith, could impact your wishlist service.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so you haven't truly achieved that clean separation that you're ultimately aiming for.
It's almost like you've given the team autonomy,
Yes.
but then you've kind of left them hanging with this data dependency.
Exactly. It's a classic trade-off.
Okay, so you have to kind of weigh those short-term gains versus that long-term decoupling.
Right.
Now, even if a team decides to go with this code-first approach,
Yeah.
it's not just about, moving the code over.
No.
Our discussion suggests that there's some essential preliminary work,
Absolutely.
especially around thinking about the data.
You need to have a good understanding of how that data will eventually be extracted.
Okay, so even though we're not physically moving the data right away,
Right.
we still need to think about it up front.
Yeah, you need at least a high-level plan.
Why is that so important?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
What if you spend all this effort separating the code,
Yeah.
and then you realize that the data is so intertwined with the rest of the monolith that it's impossible to extract cleanly?
Oh.
You've basically wasted a lot of time and effort.
Right, you've hit a dead end.
Yeah, exactly.
And on the flip side, what if you successfully separate the code,
Right.
but then you have no plan for the data?
You're stuck.
Yeah, you're stuck with a service that can't really stand on its own.
Right.
So it's like we need to do a feasibility check on both fronts,
Exactly.
even if we're only tackling one first.
It's about managing risk and avoiding those nasty surprises down the line.
Okay, so sketch out a strategy for both the code and the data migration
Yeah, even if it's just a rough outline.
before you even start writing any code.
It's exactly. That'll save you a lot of headaches later.
That makes a lot of sense.
Now, we've talked about code first,
Yeah,
but there's another approach we've discussed
right.
that might seem a bit counterintuitive at first,
Okay.
and that's the data first approach.
Okay, so this is where we flip the script.
Yeah, we switch the order of operations.
Instead of starting with the code, we start by focusing on the data.
Exactly.
So we take the wish list data and we move it to a brand new separate database.
Right.
But the code that uses that data initially stays in the monolith.
Yeah, that's the key difference.
So I'm picturing like we've got the monolith still connected to its original database,
Yeah,
but now there's this whole new database just for wish list data.
exactly. And the wish list code in the monolith is now talking to this new database.
So the code is still living in the monolith, but it's reaching out to the separate database for its data.
Exactly.
It feels kind of backward, though,
I know, it seems counterintuitive.
because the goal is to eventually break apart the monolith.
Right.
So why would you choose to move the data first?
Well, the main advantage is that it forces you to deal with the hardest part up front,
Okay.
the data.
Okay.
By moving the data first, you immediately find out if it's even possible to cleanly separate that wish list data without breaking other things.
So if there are a lot of relationships.
Yeah, if the data's all tangled up,
Yeah.
you'll discover that right away.
And then you can adjust your approach accordingly.
Exactly.
But what are some of the challenges that might come up when you separate the data while the code is still in the monolith?
Yeah, so this approach definitely introduces its own set of complexities.
Okay.
For example, you might lose some of the built-in data integrity checks that you had when everything was in one database.
Oh, okay. Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So
Yeah.
imagine you have a rule that says a customer must always have a valid address.
Okay.
When your data is all in one place,
Yeah.
the database can enforce that rule for you.
Right.
But when you split the data,
Yeah. You need to find new ways to ensure that that rule is still enforced.
across these two separate systems.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about things like transactions?
Yeah, that's another big one.
Because I imagine in a monolith, you might have had a transaction that touched both wish list data and some other data.
Right. And that all happened as one atomic operation.
Yeah.
But now that the data is in two different places,
Right.
you need to make sure that both parts of the transaction complete successfully.
Even if one of the databases has a problem or something.
Exactly. You need to think about how to handle those kinds of failures.
So it sounds like this approach can actually be quite complex in the short term,
It can be.
but the benefit is that you're tackling these data challenges early on.
Exactly. You're de-risking the overall migration.
Okay, so you're proving that the data separation is feasible
Right.
before you introduce the added complexity of a new service.
Yeah, you're kind of isolating the data problem.
Okay, that's an interesting way to think about it. It's all about finding the right strategy for your specific situation.
You know, we've been talking a lot about the back end,
Right, the code and the data.
the code and the data,
Yeah.
but we also need to consider how all of this relates to the user interface.
Absolutely, the UI is a crucial part of the equation.
And I think it's easy to forget about that when you're so focused on the back end.
Yeah, it's easy to get tunnel vision.
But if we ignore the UI,
Right.
we could end up with a really flexible back end,
Yeah.
but a front end that's still a big monolithic mess.
And that can become a bottleneck.
Right, because even if your back-end services are all independent, if
Yeah.
your UI is still a monolith,
Right.
it's going to be hard to deploy changes quickly.
Exactly.
So it sounds like we need to think about decomposing the UI as well.
We do, and it's often helpful to think about it in parallel with the backend changes.
Okay, so as we're figuring out how to extract the code or the data,
Right.
we should also be thinking about how that impacts the UI. And should we assume that when we extract a back-end service,
Yeah.
there's going to be like a perfectly corresponding piece of the UI that we can also extract?
Not necessarily.
Right.
The relationship between microservices and the UI is rarely one-to-one.
Okay, so a single microservice might be used by multiple parts of the UI,
Exactly.
or a single screen in the UI might pull data from multiple microservices.
Right. It's not always a clean mapping.
So it sounds like the UI decomposition can be a bit more complex.
It can be.
And when does that typically happen?
Well, it often happens after you've made some initial backend changes.
Okay.
Once you have some independent services in place,
Yeah.
it becomes clearer how to break apart the UI.
You can start to see the boundaries.
Exactly.
But the key is that you don't want the UI to lag too far behind.
Right. You want to keep the front end and the back end moving forward together.
Because ultimately the goal is to have a fully decomposed system.
Yeah, where both the back end and the front end are flexible and independent.
Okay, so to summarize our discussion on these initial steps,
Yeah.
we've looked at two main strategies, code first and data first.
Right.
Code first is where you focus on extracting the code for a specific feature,
Yeah, like our wish list example.
while initially leaving the data in the original database.
Right, and that can give you some quick wins in terms of team structure and deployment.
And then data first is where you focus on extracting the data first,
Right.
which can be a good way to de-risk the overall migration by tackling the data challenges up front.
Exactly.
And the decision of which path to take really depends on a lot of factors.
Yeah, things like the complexity of your existing monolith,
Yeah,
the skills of your team,
right.
your risk tolerance.
It's a judgment call.
It is.
Now, I'm curious from your perspective, thinking about these initial steps,
Yeah.
what other big challenges do you think people should anticipate when they're moving towards a microservices architecture?
Well, there are a lot of challenges.
Like, what are some of the things that keep you up at night?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is data consistency.
Hmm.
When you have data spread across multiple services,
Yeah.
how do you make sure that it all stays in sync?
Especially when things go wrong,
Exactly.
right?
You have to think about things like distributed transactions
Yeah.
and eventual consistency.
How do the services talk to each other?
Yeah, that's another big one.
Like, what are the patterns for communication?
So you have to think about API design,
Okay.
message queues,
Right.
service discovery.
It feels like these initial steps are just the beginning.
They are.
It's like the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. There's a whole world of complexity beneath the surface.
But it's an exciting world.
It is. It's a fascinating journey.
And it's a journey that more and more organizations are taking.
Absolutely. Microservices are becoming the norm.
So if you're preparing for a senior engineering role,
Yeah.
this is definitely an area that you need to be comfortable with.
You need to understand the challenges
The trade-offs,
and the best practices,
it's a lot to learn.
but it's worth it. It is, because microservices can unlock a lot of benefits.
Right, like increased agility,
Yeah.
scalability,
Right.
and resilience.
Absolutely.
So keep learning, keep exploring.
And keep diving deep.